Okay, so get this. We're diving into former President Trump's potential second-term cabinet, and let me tell you, it's causing quite a stir.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique lineup.
That's one way to put it. We've got this news article here, and it highlights all these Indian Americans in key positions,
Mm.
which is interesting on its own.
Yeah,
But then there's this other layer to it that's really got people talking about it, their religion.
right.
We're looking at a cabinet with a lot of openly Hindu members.
Yeah, it's pretty unprecedented, really. I mean, to
Yeah.
see this level of representation from any religious group, let alone one that hasn't really been all that prominent in American politics historically.
Yeah, it's definitely something new.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable.
Okay, so let's break down who we're actually talking about here. First up, we've got Kesh Patel, a familiar name in Trump's world, right?
Hmm.
And he's slated as FBI director.
Yeah, Patel's been a pretty vocal supporter of the former president,
Yeah.
and he's taken some controversial stances, shall we say,
Mm.
particularly when it comes to the Ram Mandir temple in Ayodhya.
Right. He's been pretty critical of how the American media has portrayed the temple and its history. And speaking of outspoken figures, we've also got Vivek Ramaswamy heading up this brand new government efficiency department.
Mm.
You might remember him from his presidential run.
Oh, yeah, Ramaswamy's been very open about his Hindu faith, even stating that it's going to guide his commitment to protecting religious liberty,
Interesting.
which is particularly interesting given his proposed role.
Right.
I mean, he could have influence over things like religious exemptions to certain laws.
Yeah, that definitely makes you wonder how those beliefs might actually translate into policy.
Yeah.
And it's not just those two. We've got Dr. J. Bhattacharya, originally from Kolkata, nominated to lead the National Institutes of Health.
Yeah, his background in public health and economics will be interesting to watch, especially considering the role that faith often plays in healthcare decisions.
Right. And then there's the potential Second Lady Usha Chilukuri Vance, married to J.D. Vance, the hypothetical VP.
Right. Her presence adds another dimension to this whole discussion about faith and identity in the public sphere.
Yeah. So we've got this cabinet potentially shaping major policy decisions, and a good number of them are openly talking about how their Hindu beliefs inform their worldview. It's bound to make some waves, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. It raises some serious questions about the separation of church and state, a principle that's been at the very heart of American democracy since its founding.
Yeah, that whole separation of church and state thing we learn about in school. But to be honest, I don't think I ever really grasped what it actually means in practice.
It's one of those things that sounds simple on the surface but gets incredibly complex when you start trying to apply it to real-world situations.
Hmm.
Essentially, it's meant to prevent any one religion from having undue influence over the government, ensuring that everyone's beliefs are respected.
Okay, that makes sense. How do we actually measure that? I mean, is it even realistic to expect people to, like, completely separate their personal beliefs from their professional decisions?
That is the million-dollar question. And there's no easy answer. What's fascinating here, though, is that this cabinet, whether it becomes reality or not, forces us to confront that question head on.
Yeah.
It does. It really does.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really gets to the heart of, what it means to have religious freedom in a pluralistic society. Like, it's one thing to say everyone has the right to believe what they want,
Right.
but it's another thing entirely to figure out how those beliefs actually interact with the responsibilities of holding public office.
Right, because it's not like these folks are just going to clock in, leave their beliefs at the door, and make decisions in some kind of neutral vacuum.
Exactly. And to pretend otherwise would be naive.
Hmm.
The question then becomes, how do we ensure that those beliefs are being applied fairly,
Right.
and not used to advance a particular religious agenda?
So how do we even begin to unpack that? I mean, where's the line between someone simply bringing their worldview to the table, which everyone does,
Right.
and crossing over into something that might be considered, I don't know, inappropriate influence?
Yeah, that's where things get really tricky. There's no easy formula or checklist. We have to look at their actions, their policy decisions, the justifications they offer for those decisions.
Okay. You mentioned Patel's views on the Ram Mandir temple earlier. How might that perspective actually play out in his role as FBI director? Hypothetically speaking, of course.
Well, consider the fact that the FBI often deals with issues of domestic terrorism,
Right.
including groups motivated by religious extremism. Patel's strong stance on the Ram Mandir temple, which has been a real flashpoint for Hindu-Muslim tensions,
Yeah.
could raise concerns about how he might prioritize certain threats or perceive potential biases.
That's a really good point. It's almost like he's coming in with this pre-existing narrative about a particular conflict,
Right.
which could then affect his judgment.
Precisely. On the other hand, his perspective might also bring valuable insights into understanding certain extremist ideologies. So it's a double-edged sword, really.
Yeah.
It requires careful scrutiny.
It makes you wonder, too, about Ramaswamy and his stance on religious liberty. He's going to be in charge of government efficiency, right?
Right.
That sounds pretty broad.
It is, and it means he could potentially have a say in things like religious exemptions to anti-discrimination laws or funding for faith-based initiatives.
Right.
So how his Hindu beliefs might influence those decisions is something worth paying attention to.
Yeah. Okay, so we're seeing how this could play out in very concrete ways. This isn't just some abstract philosophical debate.
Right.
It has real-world implications.
Absolutely. And
Right.
that's exactly why this cabinet selection has sparked such a, I don't know, heated conversation.
Right.
It forces us to confront questions we might otherwise shy away from.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, because this isn't just about Hinduism, right? This raises broader questions about how any religious belief system might influence someone's approach to governing.
You're exactly right. This cabinet is almost like a case study,
Yeah.
a microcosm of this much larger conversation happening in America and around the world about the role of faith in public life.
So what can we as regular people do with all of this? It's not like we have a direct line to these potential cabinet members.
Right. That's where critical thinking comes in. We need to be informed citizens, engaging with the news, questioning what we hear, seeking out diverse perspectives. We can't just passively accept whatever narrative is being presented to us.
Especially when it comes to something as complex as this, where there are so many different angles to consider.
Right. And remember, the media plays a crucial role in shaping public perception.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Patel even accused them of having a biased narrative when it comes to the Ram Mandir temple. Do you think there's any truth to that?
I honestly don't know. I mean, we all know the media can be biased, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally.
Right.
But how do we as consumers of news filter through all of that and get to something resembling the truth?
It's tough.
Yeah.
We have to be active participants in the information process. We need to read critically, question sources, compare different accounts of the same event, be wary of sensationalized headlines.
It's almost like we need a media literacy boot camp for the 21st century.
Yeah.
But seriously, it sounds like you're saying we can't just outsource our thinking to someone else. We have to do the work ourselves.
Exactly. And that's where these deep dives come in, right?
Right.
I mean, we're not giving you all the answers, but we're hopefully giving you the tools to ask the right questions.
Okay, so we've talked about potential conflicts of interest, the role of the media, the importance of critical thinking. What else should we be keeping in mind as we try to make sense of this hypothetical cabinet and its implications?
Well, one thing that's particularly interesting to me is the potential impact on U.S.-India relations.
Okay.
You know, India is a rising global power, and its relationship with the U.S. is becoming increasingly important both economically and strategically.
Right, we touched on that earlier. But how might this cabinet with its multiple high-profile Indian-American members affect that dynamic?
That's what we'll explore next.
So U.S.-India relations, what are we talking about here? What are some of the big things?
Well, there are a lot of shared interest, of course. Both countries are concerned about China's growing influence, for one.
Right.
They're both major players in the global economy.
Uh-huh.
And there are strong cultural and people-to-people ties.
Right, but there are also some points of tension, right? I mean, it's not all sunshine and roses.
Oh, absolutely. Trade disputes, different views on human rights issues.
Yeah.
And India's long-standing relationship with Russia. All of those have caused some friction in the past.
Okay, so how might this cabinet, with its strong Indian-American presence and, the open expression of Hindu faith, how might that impact those areas of tension?
It's really hard to say for sure, but it's definitely something worth thinking about. Some argue that this cabinet could actually lead to closer ties between the two countries,
Okay.
particularly on issues like defense cooperation and countering terrorism.
Yeah, I can see how having people in key positions who understand both Indian and American perspectives would be really helpful in navigating those complex issues.
Exactly. They could act as bridges, fostering greater understanding and building trust.
Right.
But there are also potential downsides.
It's like what kind of downsides are we talking about?
Well, some critics worry that this cabinet might be too sympathetic to India's interests, potentially overlooking human rights concerns or giving India a pass on issues where the U.S. and India have traditionally disagreed.
So it's kind of a delicate balance. On the one hand, closer ties with India could be really beneficial.
Right.
But on the other hand, we don't want to compromise American values or interests.
Exactly. And then there's this whole issue of Hindu nationalism.
To be honest, I'm not really super familiar with that term.
Okay.
Could you maybe break it down for me? What does that even mean?
Sure. Essentially, it's a political ideology that seeks to promote Hindu identity and culture as like central to the Indian nation.
Okay.
Some people see it as a pretty benign expression of cultural pride,
Mm-hmm.
while others view it as exclusionary and even dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
particularly for religious minorities in India.
I see. So how does all of this relate back to our conversation about the potential Trump cabinet?
Well, some of the individuals we've been discussing today, particularly Patel and Ramaswamy, have expressed views that kind of align with Hindu nationalist sentiments.
Okay.
This has raised concerns about whether they might actually bring those ideologies into their roles in the U.S. government.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a point of contention, especially given the emphasis on religious pluralism and tolerance here in the U.S.
It's definitely something that will be closely watched if this cabinet actually comes to fruition.
Hmm.
The way they navigate these complex issues will have implications not only for U.S.-India relations, but also for the domestic political landscape here in the U.S.
Wow. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground today.
Right.
We started with this hypothetical cabinet full of Indian Americans, many of them openly Hindu. And we've explored the potential implications for everything from religious freedom to U.S.-India relations. So what's the key takeaway here? What should our listeners be thinking about as they try to process all of this information?
I think the main point is this. This cabinet, whether it becomes a reality or not, highlights a much broader trend: the growing influence of diverse religious perspectives in American society,
Yeah.
and the really complex questions that arise when those perspectives intersect with public life.
It's definitely a lot to unpack. And it's not just about this one specific cabinet or even just about politics. It's about how we as a society navigate the increasing diversity of beliefs and identities in a way that is both respectful and fair.
Exactly. And it's not something with easy answers. It requires open dialogue, critical thinking, a willingness to engage with perspectives that might be different from our own.
Well said. This deep dive has given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for our listeners. Remember, folks, keep those brains engaged, stay curious, and keep asking those tough questions. Thanks for joining us.